Sarah Mitchell, a 22-year-old from a struggling single-parent household in Detroit, has worked multiple jobs while studying business administration to support her sick mother. Despite her brilliant academic record, she can barely afford basic supplies. During the final interview for a prestigious internship at Harrison Industries, her only chance to change her family's fate, she realizes she forgot to bring a pen. Too embarrassed to ask the other polished candidates, she quietly borrows one from Emma, another applicant who seems kind. Unbeknownst to Sarah, CEO James Harrison is secretly observing the candidate's behavior in the waiting room through security cameras, looking not just for qualifications, but for character. Her small act of humility and Emma's act of kindness catches his attention in ways the perfectly prepared presentations never could. What starts as a desperate moment becomes the beginning of an extraordinary journey of mentorship, love, and discovering that sometimes our greatest weaknesses become our most powerful strengths. I still remember exactly how my hands were shaking that Tuesday morning in October, not from the cold Detroit wind that cut through my thin blazer, the only professional outfit I owned, but from the weight of everything that morning represented. 22 years old, standing in front of the gleaming Harrison Industries building, and I knew this was it, my one shot. The elevator ride to the 34th floor felt like an eternity. I pressed my back against the mirrored wall, trying to steady my breathing, watching the floor numbers climb higher than I'd ever been in my life. When the doors opened, I stepped into a world that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The waiting area was pristine, all glass and chrome with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And there they were, my competition. 50 candidates, they'd told us, for 3 internship positions. I counted at least 20 people already seated, each one looking like they'd stepped out of a business magazine. Designer suits, leather portfolios, confidence radiating from every pore. I found an empty chair in the back corner and sat down carefully, smoothing my skirt, a hand-me-down from my mother's working days before the illness took her strength. My portfolio was a simple black folder from the dollar store, but inside were grades that I'd fought for through countless late nights, working double shifts at the diner and still making Dean's List. Sarah Mitchell. I looked up to see a woman with a clipboard approaching, professional smile, perfectly styled hair. "You're here for the Harrison Industries internship interview?" "Yes, ma'am." My voice came out smaller than I'd intended. "Wonderful. We'll begin in about 15 minutes. There's a brief written assessment first, then individual interviews. Make sure you have everything you need. Pen, pencil, calculator if necessary." My stomach dropped to the floor. Pen. I had spent the entire weekend preparing for every possible interview question, researching the company's history, practicing my handshake in the mirror. I had ironed this blazer 3 times, walked 40 minutes instead of taking the bus to save the fare, and skipped breakfast to make sure I arrived early, but I had forgotten to bring a pen. The woman moved on to the next candidate, and I sat there in stunned silence, mentally retracing my morning. I'd been so nervous about being late, so focused on making sure I looked presentable, that I'd left my pen sitting on the kitchen table next to my mother's medication. Around me, other candidates were pulling out expensive-looking pens from leather cases, checking their phones, making small talk about their university experiences. I heard fragments of conversations about study abroad programs, internships at Fortune 500 companies, connections their fathers had in the business world. Each word felt like a reminder of everything I lacked. I considered my options. I could ask the receptionist, but what if she thought I was unprepared? What if word got back to the interviewers that I couldn't even remember basic supplies? I could try to borrow from one of the other candidates, but they were all strangers, and they were my competition. Why would they help me succeed over them? The minutes ticked by, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I got when the electricity bill arrived and I wasn't sure we could pay it, or when my mother had another coughing fit that lasted too long. The feeling of being trapped by circumstances I couldn't control. I closed my eyes and thought about why I was here. Not for me, really. For my mother, who had worked herself sick trying to provide for us after my father left when I was 12. For every night she'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table with bills spread around her, calculator in hand, trying to make the numbers work. For every time she'd insisted I focus on school while she handled everything else, even as her health deteriorated from the stress and the long hours cleaning office buildings downtown. This internship wasn't just about money, though God knows we needed it. It was about proving that all her sacrifices meant something, that a girl from our neighborhood could make it in a world like this. I opened my eyes and looked around the room again. That's when I noticed her. A young woman about my age sitting 2 chairs away, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She wasn't talking to anyone else, just quietly reviewing her notes. Something about her seemed different from the others, less intimidating somehow. Our eyes met for a moment, and she smiled. A real smile, not the polished networking kind I'd been seeing all morning. I took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything, though I had no way of knowing it then. I leaned toward her, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "Excuse me," I whispered. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I made the most embarrassing mistake. I forgot to bring a pen. Would you happen to have an extra one I could borrow?" The words hung in the air between us, and I held my breath waiting for her to judge me, to realize that someone who forgot basic supplies probably didn't belong here. Instead, her smile widened. "Of course," she said, reaching into her purse without hesitation. "Here, take this one. I always bring extras. I'm constantly losing pens." She handed me a simple blue ballpoint pen, nothing fancy, but in that moment it felt like the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you so much," I said, relief flooding through me. "You have no idea how much this means to me." "I'm Emma, by the way. Emma Walsh. Sarah Mitchell. And seriously, thank you. I can't believe I was so nervous I forgot something so basic." Emma laughed, a sound that was genuinely warm. "Trust me, we've all been there. I once showed up to a final exam with no calculator for statistics, had to do everything by hand. Sometimes the stress makes us forget the simplest things." For the first time all morning, I felt like I could breathe properly. Here was someone who understood that being here was nerve-wracking, who didn't make me feel stupid for my mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," the woman with the clipboard called out, "we're ready to begin. Please take your seats in the conference room. You'll find your assigned seats with your name cards." As we filed into the conference room, Emma walked beside me. "You're going to do great," she said quietly. "I can tell." I wanted to ask her how she could possibly know that, but we were being seated, and I needed to focus. The conference room was even more intimidating than the waiting area, a massive table surrounded by leather chairs, with Harrison Industries logo etched into the glass wall behind the head of the table. I found my name card about halfway down the table and sat down, Emma's pen clutched in my hand like a lifeline. The written assessment was placed in front of me, 3 pages of questions about business scenarios, market analysis, and strategic thinking. As I wrote my name at the top of the page, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Growing up in a neighborhood where most people didn't finish high school, let alone go to college, working since I was 15 to help with bills, studying by streetlight when we couldn't afford to keep the electricity on late, choosing community college first to save money before transferring to a 4-year university. Every answer I wrote on that assessment was informed by more than just textbook knowledge. When they asked about managing limited resources, I thought about stretching groceries for 2 weeks on $40. When they asked about motivating a team under pressure, I remembered organizing my co-workers at the diner to cover each other's shifts when life got complicated. When they asked about long-term strategic planning, I thought about the 5-year plan I'd written and rewritten a dozen times, mapping out every step from graduation to a career that could provide stability for my mother and me. I poured everything I had into that assessment, using Emma's pen to fill page after page with insights that came from living with uncertainty, from understanding what it meant to work for something that felt impossible but necessary. When I finished and looked around the room, I noticed that several other candidates were already done, some looking confident, others checking their watches anxiously. Emma caught my eye from across the table and gave me an encouraging nod. As we handed in our assessments and returned to the waiting area, I tried to give Emma back her pen. "Keep it," she said, "for luck. And for your individual interview." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. Besides, I have a feeling you'll do something amazing with it." What neither Emma nor I knew was that during our entire time in the waiting area, we'd been observed. In his office on the 41st floor, James Harrison, 35 years old and CEO of the company his grandfather had built, was reviewing the day's security footage. It was something he'd started doing for important hirings, wanting to see how candidates behaved when they thought no one was watching. He'd watched candidate after candidate arrive, seen the networking, the posturing, the careful image management. He'd noted who looked down on the security guard, who dismissed the receptionist, who only spoke to people they perceived as useful. But he'd also watched a young woman in a blazer that had seen better days ask to borrow a pen, and he'd watched another woman offer it without hesitation. He'd seen genuine kindness in a space where everyone was competing for the same prize. He'd seen humility that seemed real. not performed. James Harrison had built his success on reading people, on understanding that character often mattered more than credentials, and sitting in his office, reviewing the footage of two young women who had just shown him something authentic in a room full of perfect performances, he made a note in his calendar. He wanted to interview Sarah Mitchell personally, but I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I had made it through the first round, that I had a pen for whatever came next, and that maybe, just maybe, I belonged in this building after all. The next hour felt like the longest of my life. One by one, candidates were called for their individual interviews. I watched as confident-looking people disappeared through the glass doors of the conference room, some returning with satisfied smiles, others with carefully neutral expressions that didn't quite hide their disappointment. Emma had been called about 20 minutes ago. When she came back, she looked drained but hopeful. "It went well, I think," she whispered as she sat back down beside me. "They asked a lot about problem solving under pressure. How did you answer the resource management question on the written test?" I was about to respond when I heard my name. "Sarah Mitchell?" My heart jumped into my throat. This was it. I stood up on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment, smoothing my skirt one more time. Emma squeezed my hand quickly. "Remember what I said. You've got this." I followed the woman with the clipboard toward the conference room, but instead of stopping there, she kept walking toward the elevators. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think there might be a mistake. Aren't the interviews in the conference room?" She turned and smiled, but it was different from her earlier professional smile. This one seemed almost excited. "No mistake, Miss Mitchell. You've been selected for a special interview. Mr. Harrison would like to meet with you personally." My mouth went dry. "Mr. Harrison? As in James Harrison? The CEO?" "That's correct. 41st floor." The elevator ride up those 7 additional floors was a blur. I stared at my reflection in the polished steel doors, trying to process what was happening. Why would the CEO want to interview me personally? Had I done something wrong on the assessment? Was this how they delivered rejections to people who clearly didn't belong? The 41st floor was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Where the 34th floor had been impressive, this was breathtaking. The entire wall was floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Detroit River. Original artwork lined the hallways, and everything was bathed in natural light that made the space feel almost ethereal. "Mr. Harrison will see you now," the woman said, stopping in front of a door that was larger and more imposing than seemed necessary. I knocked, heard a voice say, "Come in," and stepped into what felt like another world entirely. James Harrison's office was the size of my entire apartment. The same floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk that looked like it was carved from a single piece of dark wood, and sitting behind it was a man who looked nothing like what I'd expected. He was younger than I'd imagined, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was handsome in the way that people with money often are, well-groomed, well-dressed, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about basic necessities. But there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite identify. "Miss Mitchell," he said, standing up and extending his hand. "Please have a seat." I shook his hand, firm grip just like I'd practiced, and sat down in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. The chair was more comfortable than any piece of furniture I'd ever sat in. "I have to admit," he said, settling back into his chair, "your application intrigued me." I waited for him to continue, not trusting myself to speak without my voice shaking. "Your GPA is exceptional, especially considering your course load and work schedule. 3 jobs while maintaining Dean's List status is impressive." He opened what I assumed was my file. But what really caught my attention wasn't your grades. My stomach dropped. Here it comes, I thought. The part where he explains that people like me don't belong in places like this. "Tell me about this morning," he said instead. "I'm sorry. This morning in the waiting area, tell me what happened." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Somehow he knew about the pen. Maybe Emma had mentioned it during her interview. Maybe it was some kind of test I'd failed. I made a mistake," I said carefully. "I forgot to bring a pen for the assessment. I had to ask another candidate if I could borrow one." "And how did that make you feel?" The question caught me off guard. In all my interview preparation, I'd never considered that someone might ask about my feelings. "Embarrassed," I said honestly. "Ashamed, I guess. Here I am competing for this incredible opportunity, and I can't even remember to bring basic supplies." It felt like proof that maybe I didn't deserve to be there. James Harrison leaned forward slightly. "But you asked for help anyway." "I had to. This interview, this internship, it's everything to me. I couldn't let pride get in the way of the opportunity." Tell me why it's everything to you." And suddenly, sitting in that beautiful office with this powerful man across from me, I found myself telling the truth. Not the polished version I'd rehearsed, but the real truth. "My mother is sick," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "She's been sick for years, but it's getting worse. She worked herself into the ground trying to provide for us after my father left, and now she can barely work at all. The medical bills are substantial. I've been supporting us both while going to school, but it's not sustainable. This internship isn't just about my career. It's about being able to take care of the person who sacrificed everything for me." I stopped abruptly, realizing I'd probably said too much. Professional interviews weren't supposed to be about personal problems. I was supposed to talk about my passion for business, my 5-year plan, my commitment to excellence. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to—" "Don't apologize," he said, his voice softer than it had been before. "Do you know why I wanted to meet with you today, Miss Mitchell?" I shook my head. "Because in a room full of people trying to impress me with their connections and credentials, you did something different. You showed humility. You asked for help when you needed it, and you did it with grace. And the young woman who helped you, she showed kindness to someone she was competing against." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "I built this company on the belief that character matters more than pedigree," he said. "Don't get me wrong. Competence is essential, but I can teach someone business skills. I can't teach them to be genuine, to show humility, to treat people with kindness even when it doesn't benefit them directly." He turned back to face me. "Your assessment scores were the highest of all 50 candidates by a significant margin. Your answers showed not just theoretical knowledge, but practical understanding that comes from real experience, from struggle." I felt like I couldn't breathe. The highest scores. Out of all 50 people? "But more than that," he continued, "you showed me something in that waiting room that I rarely see in spaces like this. Authenticity. The willingness to be vulnerable when it mattered." He walked back to his desk and sat down. "I'm going to offer you something, Miss Mitchell, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. I'm not offering you the internship." My heart sank so fast I felt physically dizzy. "I'm offering you a direct mentorship position. You would work directly with me, learning not just the technical aspects of running a business, but the leadership philosophy that has made this company successful. It would be full-time with a salary that I suspect would solve your immediate financial concerns, and it would position you for a permanent role here after your graduation." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. "I'm offering you a job, Sarah, not an internship. A real position with real responsibility and real compensation." The room felt like it was spinning. "But why? I mean, I'm grateful, incredibly grateful, but I don't understand why you would—" "Because I've been doing this for 15 years, he said. "And I've learned that the best employees aren't always the ones with the most impressive resumes. They're the ones with character, resilience, and the humility to keep learning. You've already shown me all three." I thought about my mother, sitting at home with her medical bills spread across the kitchen table. I thought about the past 4 years of night shifts and weekend work, of choosing between textbooks and groceries, of walking 40 minutes to save bus fare. If this part of my story moved you somehow, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. I found myself thinking, overwhelmed by the surreal nature of what was happening. "There is one condition," James said, bringing me back to the moment. "Of course, anything. I want you to bring Emma Walsh with you." "Emma? The woman who lent you the pen?" I was equally impressed by her kindness and her qualifications. This mentorship program works best with multiple participants who can learn from each other. Would you be comfortable with that arrangement? Comfortable? The woman who had saved my entire interview with a simple act of kindness, who had made me feel less alone in that intimidating waiting room. "I would love that," I said, meaning every word. "Excellent. Can you start Monday?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to work properly. "Good. Miss Rodriguez will give you all the details. Salary information, benefits, everything you'll need to know." He stood up, signaling the end of the interview, and extended his hand again. "Welcome to Harrison Industries, Sarah. I have a feeling this is going to be the beginning of something extraordinary." As I walked back to the elevator, my mind was reeling. In the span of one morning, my entire life had changed. The financial stress that had been crushing my family for years would be lifted. My mother could get proper medical care. I could focus on learning instead of just surviving. But more than that, someone had seen something in me that I hadn't even seen in myself. Someone had looked past my dollar store portfolio and second-hand blazer and seen potential. When the elevator doors opened on the 34th floor, Emma was still in the waiting area along with about a dozen other candidates. She looked up hopefully when she saw me. "How did it go?" I sat down beside her, still trying to process everything that had just happened. "Emma," I said, "what would you say if I told you that both of us just got a lot more than we came here looking for?" Monday morning arrived with a crispness in the October air that felt like possibility itself. I stood in front of my small bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my new blouse, the first piece of professional clothing I'd ever bought with my own money, instead of finding at a thrift store. The salary advance Mr. Harrison had approved over the weekend had allowed me to purchase a few essential items, but more importantly, it had allowed me to take my mother to see a specialist. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Mom said from the doorway, her voice still weak but her eyes brighter than I'd seen them in months. The relief of knowing that proper medical care was now within reach had lifted a weight from both our shoulders that we hadn't even realized we'd been carrying. "I still can't believe this is real," I admitted, smoothing my skirt nervously. "What if I mess this up? What if I don't belong there?" Mom walked over and placed her hands on my shoulders, the way she used to when I was little and afraid of starting a new school year. "Sarah Michelle Mitchell, you listen to me. You earned this. Not because of luck, not because someone felt sorry for you, but because you worked harder than anyone else and showed them who you really are." I hugged her carefully. She felt so fragile these days, and headed out into the morning that would change everything I thought I knew about business, about myself, and about the man who had already begun to transform my life. The 41st floor looked different on a Monday morning, bustling with activity, people in expensive suits moving with purpose, the energy of important decisions being made. I checked in with Miss Rodriguez, who handed me a badge with my name and photo that still didn't seem real. "Sarah Mitchell, Executive Development Program. Mr. Harrison is waiting for you in Conference Room A," she said with a warm smile. Miss Walsh arrived about 10 minutes ago. Conference Room A was smaller than the massive conference room where we'd taken our assessment, but somehow more intimidating. The table was polished to a mirror shine, and sitting at the head of it was James Harrison, looking every inch the CEO in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I'd made in 3 months at the diner. Emma was already seated to his right, looking nervous but excited. She'd also invested in some new professional attire, and I felt a surge of gratitude that I wouldn't be navigating this new world alone. "Good morning, Sarah," James said, gesturing to the chair on his left. "Please sit, we have a lot to cover today." As I settled into my chair, he opened a leather portfolio and looked at both of us with an expression that was businesslike, but not unkind. "Before we begin, I want to establish some ground rules for this mentorship. First, you'll be working directly with me on real projects with real consequences. This isn't busy work or a glorified internship. You'll have access to confidential information, and I'll expect the highest level of discretion and professionalism." Emma and I nodded, exchanging a glance that said we both understood the magnitude of what we were being trusted with. "Second, I believe in learning by doing. You'll make mistakes. Everyone does. What matters is how quickly you learn from them and how you apply those lessons going forward." He paused and his expression softened slightly. "Third, and this is important, I didn't choose either of you because I felt sorry for your circumstances. I chose you because you demonstrated qualities that can't be taught: integrity, resilience, and genuine care for others. Don't let imposter syndrome convince you otherwise." It was like he could read my mind. The voice that had been whispering doubts since Friday afternoon quieted a little. "Now," he said, sliding identical folders across the table to each of us, "let's talk about your first project." I opened the folder to find documents about Harrison Industries' community outreach program, or rather, the lack thereof. The company had grown rapidly over the past decade, but their charitable giving and community involvement had remained minimal. "The board has been pressuring me to develop a more robust corporate social responsibility program," James explained. "Not just for public relations purposes, but because I believe companies have an obligation to give back to the communities that support them." He stood up and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. "Here's the challenge. I want you two to research and propose a comprehensive CSR strategy for Harrison Industries. You'll have access to our financial data, our current community partnerships, and our employee volunteer records. Your goal is to develop something meaningful and sustainable, not just a tax write-off." Emma raised her hand tentatively. "What's our timeline for this?" 6 weeks. You'll present your findings and recommendations to the full board of directors." My stomach dropped. "The board of directors? I'd never even been in the same room as one director, let alone presented to an entire board. James must have noticed our expressions because he smiled. I know it sounds daunting, but remember, you're not doing this alone. You have each other and you have me. This is how you learn to handle high-stakes situations. He returned to his seat and opened another folder. For today, I want you to spend time understanding our current operations. Sarah, I'm starting you with our financial department. You'll work with Maria Santos, our CFO, to understand our budget constraints and opportunities. Emma, you'll be working with David Chen in operations to understand how our business model could support community initiatives. As we prepared to leave for our respective assignments, James called my name. Sarah, a moment. Emma squeezed my shoulder encouragingly and left the room. I turned back to James, trying to read his expression. "How is your mother?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "Better, thank you. The appointment with the specialist on Saturday was hopeful. The treatment options are expensive, but with this position," I trailed off, not sure how to finish that sentence without sounding like I was asking for more. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "I wanted you to know that our employee health insurance includes coverage for family members. Miss Rodriguez has the paperwork if you're interested." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Family health insurance. Another worry I could cross off the list that had kept me awake for so many nights. "Thank you," I whispered. "You have no idea what that means." "I think I do," he said quietly. "My mother was sick when I was about your age. Cancer. I watched my father work himself into the ground trying to pay for her treatment, and I swore that if I ever had the power to help someone else in that situation, I would." There was something in his voice, a vulnerability that felt carefully shared, that made me understand this wasn't just about business for him. "She made it through," he added. "The treatment worked. She's been in remission for 8 years now." "I'm so glad," I said and meant it. "Thank you for telling me that, and for everything." He nodded and stood up. "Now, go learn something. Maria is expecting you." Working with Maria Santos was like being thrown into the deep end of a very sophisticated pool. She was intimidating in the way that truly competent people often are. Sharp, efficient, and expecting the same level of precision from everyone around her. But she was also patient in explaining concepts that were new to me and generous with her knowledge. "Community investment isn't just about writing checks," she explained, as we reviewed budget spreadsheets that made my head spin. "It's about creating sustainable programs that benefit both the community and the company. The best CSR programs generate positive ROI in terms of employee satisfaction, customer loyalty, and brand reputation." She showed me examples of other companies' programs, some successful, others expensive failures. "The key," she said, "is authenticity. People can tell when a company actually cares about its community versus when it's just trying to improve its public image." I spent the morning learning about profit margins, budget allocation, and the complex financial considerations that went into every business decision. By lunch, my head was spinning with numbers and concepts that felt foreign but exciting. Emma and I met in the employee cafeteria, another luxury I was still getting used to. The food was actually good and subsidized for employees. "How was your morning?" I asked as we found a quiet table by the window. "Overwhelming but incredible," she said, unwrapping a sandwich. "David showed me the entire operation, how our products are made, distributed, the whole supply chain. Did you know Harrison Industries employs over 3,000 people across 5 states? I shook my head. I'd known it was a large company, but somehow the human scale of it hadn't hit me. "What about you? How was working with the CFO?" "Intimidating but educational. I'm starting to understand how complex the financial side of this really is." We spent lunch comparing notes and brainstorming ideas. Emma had learned about the company's manufacturing facilities in smaller communities that could benefit from increased investment. I had learned about budget constraints and the importance of measurable outcomes. "You know what strikes me?" Emma said as we prepared to return to our respective departments. "This isn't just a project for them. I think James genuinely cares about this." She was right. There had been something in his voice when he'd talked about corporate responsibility, the same note I'd heard when he mentioned his mother. This mattered to him personally. The afternoon flew by as Maria introduced me to more complex financial concepts and let me review actual budget proposals from previous years. By the time 5 o'clock arrived, I felt like I'd learned more about business in one day than in an entire semester of classes. As I packed up my notes, Maria smiled at me, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all day. "You did well today, Sarah. You asked good questions, And you're not afraid to admit when you don't understand something. That's going to serve you well in this field. Walking to the elevator, I felt a sense of accomplishment I'd never experienced before. This was different from the satisfaction of acing an exam or successfully managing a difficult shift at the diner. This felt like building something, contributing something meaningful. The elevator doors opened and James stepped out, looking as composed as he had that morning, despite what had probably been a 12-hour day. "How was your first day?" he asked. "Challenging but amazing," I said honestly. "I learned more today than I thought possible." "Good. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." He paused, studying my face. "Same time tomorrow, and Sarah?" "Yes. You belong here. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." As the elevator doors closed and I headed home to share the day with my mother, I realized something had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving or getting by. I was building something, learning something, becoming someone I'd never imagined I could be, and it was only the first day. 3 weeks into the project, Emma and I had fallen into a rhythm that surprised us both. We'd claimed a small conference room on the 40th floor as our unofficial headquarters, filling it with research materials, budget projections, and countless coffee cups that marked our long days of collaboration. Our friendship had deepened beyond the professional necessity that brought us together. Emma came from a middle-class family in the suburbs, not wealthy, but stable in ways I'd never experienced. Yet she never made me feel different or less than. Instead, she seemed genuinely curious about my perspective, often saying that my insights were things she'd never considered. "Look at this," she said one Tuesday morning, spreading community demographic reports across our table. "These are the neighborhoods surrounding our 3 Michigan facilities, the poverty rates, the education statistics. Sarah, some of these areas look exactly like where I grew up," I finished quietly, studying the numbers that told stories I knew by heart. 60% of children qualify for free lunch programs. 30% of adults lack high school diplomas. Average household income barely above the poverty line. James appeared in the doorway, coffee in hand, looking like he'd been there for several minutes. "Sorry to interrupt. Mind if I join you?" Over the past few weeks, these impromptu check-ins had become routine. James would appear at random times, sometimes offering guidance, sometimes just observing our process. Today, though, something felt different. There was an intensity in his expression that I'd learned to recognize as his problem-solving mode. "We were just reviewing the demographic data around our facilities," Emma explained, gesturing to the reports spread before us. James pulled up a chair and studied the documents. "What conclusions are you drawing?" I exchanged a glance with Emma. We'd been discussing this exact question for days, but I'd been hesitant to voice my thoughts. They felt too personal, too close to home. "Sarah has some interesting insights," Emma said, giving me an encouraging nod. James looked at me expectantly. "I'd like to hear them." I took a deep breath. The traditional corporate social responsibility model, writing checks to established charities, organizing volunteer days, sponsoring community events, it's not wrong, but it's not enough. Not for communities like these. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. These communities don't just need money. They need opportunities. Specifically, they need pathways out of the cycle that keeps families trapped in poverty generation after generation. I started drawing a diagram, the ideas flowing more clearly as I visualized them. What if instead of just donating to existing programs, Harrison Industries created its own pipeline? What if we identified promising high school students in these communities and offered them a clear path, mentorship, college support, guaranteed internships, and potential career opportunities? James leaned forward, his attention completely focused on what I was saying. "But not just college-bound students," I continued, warming to the topic. "What about technical training programs? Partnerships with trade schools? Creating pathways for people who want to work with their hands, who might become skilled technicians or supervisors in our facilities?" Emma pulled out her laptop and started taking notes, nodding enthusiastically. "And what about supporting small businesses in these communities, local entrepreneurs who could potentially become suppliers or partners?" "Exactly," I said, feeling the excitement build. "Instead of just taking from these communities their labor, their resources, we invest in their growth. We become partners, not just employers." I turned back to James, suddenly aware that I'd been talking for several minutes without pause. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to monopolize the conversation. It's just that I've lived this reality, and I know how much difference real opportunity can make." James stood up slowly, studying the diagram I'd drawn on the whiteboard. When he turned to face us, there was something in his expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what you've just described isn't just a corporate social responsibility program. It's a complete business philosophy, a way of thinking about our role in the communities where we operate." He walked to the window, looking out over the city. Most CSR programs are designed to make companies feel good about themselves while having minimal impact on actual problems. What you're proposing would require a fundamental shift in how we think about our business model. My heart sank. I'd overstepped, suggested something too radical, too expensive, too idealistic. It would also, he continued, turning back to face us, be exactly the kind of program that could transform not just communities, but our entire industry. Emma and I looked at each other, not sure if we'd heard correctly. "You're talking about sustainable community development," James said, returning to his chair. "Creating economic ecosystems instead of just writing checks. It's ambitious, it's complex, and it's exactly what I've been hoping someone would propose." He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Maria, could you join us in conference room 3C and bring the 5-year strategic planning documents?" He hung up and looked at us. "We're going to need to run some serious numbers on this." The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of financial projections, feasibility discussions, and strategic planning that made my head spin. Maria Santos arrived with spreadsheets and budget models, and suddenly, our idealistic vision was being translated into concrete costs and potential returns. "The initial investment would be substantial," Maria said, her fingers flying over her calculator. "But the long-term benefits, reduced turnover, improved community relations, potential tax incentives, enhanced brand reputation, the ROI could be significant." "What about implementation?" Emma asked. "How would we actually start something like this?" James leaned back in his chair, and I could see him thinking through the logistics. "We'd start small, pilot program in one community, maybe the area around our Flint facility. It's been hit hard economically, and we're one of the largest employers in the region." "I know that area," I said quietly. "It's about an hour from where I grew up. The unemployment rate there is devastating, but there are good people, hard-working people who just need opportunities." "Would you be willing to lead the pilot program?" James asked. The question hit me like a physical force. "Lead it? But I'm just a mentee. I don't have experience with—" "You have something more valuable than traditional experience," he interrupted. "You understand these communities from the inside. You know what real opportunity looks like because you've lived without it." He turned to Emma. "And you'd be perfect as operations coordinator. Your work with David has shown me that you understand how to make complex systems function efficiently." Emma looked as stunned as I felt. "You're serious about this?" "Dead serious. But I want you both to understand what you'd be taking on. This wouldn't be a side project or a feel-good initiative. This would be a major company program with real budget, real expectations, and real consequences if it doesn't work." The room fell silent as we all absorbed the magnitude of what was being discussed. "Can I ask you something?" I said to James. "Of course. Why are you trusting us with something this important? We've been here 3 weeks. We're still learning the basics of how this company operates." James smiled, and there was something almost paternal in his expression. "Do you remember what I told you about character being more important than credentials? This project needs people who understand why it matters, not just people who know how to implement programs." He stood up and walked back to the whiteboard, studying my diagram. "Besides, you're not doing this alone. Maria would handle the financial oversight. David would manage the operational integration. I'd be involved in every major decision. But the vision, the community connections, the understanding of what these programs should actually accomplish, that has to come from people who've lived this experience." I thought about my mother, about the neighborhood where I'd grown up, about all the talented people I'd known who never got the chance to show what they could do. I thought about the kids I'd tutored at the community center, bright and eager, but already starting to accept limitations that had nothing to do with their abilities. "If this program helps even one person avoid the struggle my family went through," I said, "then yes, absolutely yes." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I'm in too. This could change everything for these communities." Maria gathered her documents, shaking her head with what looked like amazement. "In 20 years of corporate finance, I've never seen a CSR proposal developed this quickly or this comprehensively. Usually, these things take months of committee meetings and consultant reports. That's because usually they're developed by people who've never experienced the problems they're trying to solve," James said. "Sarah, Emma, I want detailed implementation plans on my desk by Friday." Budget requirements, timeline, staffing needs, success metrics, everything. As we prepared to leave the meeting, James called my name again. Sarah, one more thing. This conversation we just had. This is exactly why I hired you. Not just because you're smart, though you are. Not just because you work hard, though you do. But because you see solutions where others just see problems. Walking back to our conference room, Emma grabbed my arm. "Do you realize what just happened in there?" she said, her voice filled with excitement. "We just convinced a CEO to invest potentially millions of dollars in a program we invented on the spot." "I know," I said, still trying to process it all. If someone had told me 2 months ago that I'd be designing corporate programs that could affect thousands of people's lives. "Speaking of affecting lives," Emma said with a grin, "people watching this story from around the world should know. This is what happens when you don't give up on your dreams, even when they seem impossible." As we settled back into our work, diving into the detailed planning that would turn our vision into reality, I realized something profound had shifted. I wasn't just grateful for this opportunity anymore. I was confident in my ability to make the most of it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving or getting by. I was creating something that could matter, something that could help other people find the opportunities I'd been lucky enough to stumble into. And James Harrison, this man who had seen potential in a nervous young woman borrowing a pen, was trusting me to turn that potential into something real. The week leading up to our board presentation was a blur of 18-hour days, countless revisions, and enough coffee to keep a small city awake. Emma and I had transformed our little conference room into what looked like a war room, with charts and graphs covering every available wall space, stacks of research materials threatening to topple over, and 2 very tired but determined young women trying to perfect something that could change thousands of lives. "Read me the opening again," Emma said on Thursday night, rubbing her eyes as she reviewed our financial projections for what felt like the 100th time. It was past 11 p.m. and the building was nearly empty, except for security and the cleaning crew. I cleared my throat and stood up, trying to project the confidence I'd been practicing all week. "Members of the board, what if I told you that Harrison Industries could increase employee retention by 40%, improve community relations exponentially, and create a pipeline of skilled workers for our future needs, all while generating positive publicity and substantial tax benefits?" "Good," Emma said, making a note on her copy, "but remember to make eye contact with each board member." James said Mrs. Richardson on the far left can be particularly tough to win over. The door to our conference room opened, and James walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee and looking remarkably fresh for someone who'd been in meetings since 7 a.m. "How are my star presenters holding up?" he asked, setting the coffee down and surveying our organized chaos. "Terrified but ready," I admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "James, can I ask you something?" "Always." "How many people will be in that room tomorrow?" 12 board members, myself, Maria, David, and probably a few other senior executives, so around 18 people. My stomach clenched. 18 people who could decide the fate of this entire program based on our presentation. James pulled up a chair and sat down, his expression growing serious. "Sarah, I want to tell you something about those 18 people. Half of them inherited their wealth, have never worried about where their next meal was coming from, and see corporate social responsibility as a necessary evil for public relations purposes. That didn't make me feel better. But," he continued, "the other half built their success from nothing. They understand struggle, they respect hard work, and they're looking for authentic ways to give back. Your job isn't to convince all of them, it's to speak to the ones who will understand what you're really proposing." Emma leaned forward. "What if they ask questions we can't answer?" "Then you say I don't know, but I'll find out," James said simply. "Confidence isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing how to find them and being honest about what you don't know." He stood up and walked to our main presentation board, studying the timeline we'd created for the pilot program. "There's something else I want you both to know," he said, not turning around. "Regardless of what happens tomorrow, what you've accomplished in the past month has been extraordinary. You've created something that addresses real problems with practical solutions. Whether the board approves it or not, you should be proud of that work." But I could hear something in his voice that made me think he believed in this program as much as we did. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of October weather that made Detroit feel particularly somber. I stood in front of my mirror, wearing my best professional outfit, a navy suit I'd bought with my second paycheck, still not quite believing it was mine. My mother sat on my bed, watching me apply lipstick with hands that were steadier than I'd expected. "You look like you belong in that boardroom," she said softly. "Do I? Because I feel like I'm about to walk into a world where I don't speak the language." Mom stood up and walked over to me, placing her hands on my shoulders. She looked healthier than she had in months. The new treatment was working, and the stress of financial uncertainty was no longer wearing her down. "Sarah, you've been preparing for this your entire life. Every challenge you've faced, every obstacle you've overcome, every time you've had to find a way when there didn't seem to be one. It's all led to this moment." She was right. This wasn't just about a business presentation. This was about taking everything I'd learned from struggle and turning it into something that could help others. The boardroom on the 42nd floor was even more intimidating than I'd imagined. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Detroit River, and the walls were lined with portraits of previous company leaders, all stern-faced men in expensive suits. Emma and I sat at one end of the table with our presentation materials, trying to look composed, while 18 of the most powerful people in the state filed in and took their seats. James sat at the head of the table, catching my eye and giving me an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Mrs. Richardson, the board member Emma had mentioned, was exactly as formidable as advertised, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. She reviewed our executive summary with the kind of attention that suggested she was looking for flaws. "Ladies and gentlemen," James said once everyone was seated, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell and Emma Walsh, the architects of the community development proposal you've all reviewed. Sarah, the floor is yours." I stood up, my legs feeling more solid than I'd expected, and looked around the table at faces that ranged from skeptical to curious to genuinely interested. 6 weeks ago, Mr. Harrison asked Emma and me to develop a corporate social responsibility strategy for Harrison Industries. What we discovered is that the traditional model of corporate giving, writing checks to established charities and organizing volunteer days, isn't enough to address the real challenges facing the communities where we operate. I clicked to our first slide, showing the demographic data for the neighborhoods surrounding our facilities. These are the communities that provide our workforce, that support our business, that make our success possible. And these communities are struggling with poverty rates, education gaps, and limited economic opportunities that have persisted for decades. Mrs. Richardson leaned forward slightly, studying the data with what looked like genuine interest. "What we're proposing isn't charity," I continued, feeling my confidence grow. "It's investment, sustainable, strategic investment in the economic development of these communities that will benefit both Harrison Industries and the people who live there." I clicked to the next slide, showing our comprehensive program design. The Harrison Community Pipeline would identify promising high school students and provide them with mentorship, college support, technical training opportunities, and guaranteed pathways into careers with our company. But we wouldn't stop there. Emma stood up to take over the next section, her voice clear and strong. We'd also partner with local entrepreneurs, providing microgrants and business development support to create a network of suppliers and service providers. This creates economic activity that stays within these communities instead of flowing out to larger corporations based elsewhere. She clicked through slides showing successful models from other companies, projected job creation numbers, and estimated economic impact. "The financial investment is substantial," Emma continued, "but the returns, in terms of employee loyalty, community goodwill, reduced recruiting costs, and enhanced brand reputation, justify the expense over a 5-year horizon." A board member I didn't recognize raised his hand. "What makes you think this approach will work where others have failed?" I felt my heart rate spike, but James had prepared us for this exact question. "Because most corporate community programs are designed by people who've never experienced the problems they're trying to solve," I said. "They're based on assumptions about what communities need, instead of listening to what those communities actually want." I clicked to a slide showing quotes from interviews Emma and I had conducted with residents of our target communities. We spent 2 weeks talking to people in these neighborhoods: parents, students, small business owners, community leaders. What we heard consistently was that people don't want handouts. They want opportunities. They want to know that if they work hard and develop skills, there will be pathways to stability and success. Mrs. Richardson spoke for the first time. "Miss Mitchell, this program would require significant oversight and management. What qualifies you to lead something of this magnitude? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel everyone in the room watching me, waiting to see how I'd respond to what was clearly a test. Mrs. Richardson, you're absolutely right that this program requires experienced leadership and careful oversight. I wouldn't propose leading it alone. Maria Santos would handle financial management, David Chen would manage operational integration, and Mr. Harrison would maintain executive oversight. I paused, looking directly at her. But what I bring to this program is something that can't be taught in business school or learned from consulting reports. I understand these communities because I come from them. I know what real opportunity looks like because I've lived without it. And I know the difference between programs that actually help and programs that just make the people running them feel good about themselves. The room was completely silent. I could see James watching me with what looked like pride, but I couldn't read the expressions of the board members. If you're from around the world and watching this story unfold, I found myself thinking, you should know that sometimes the most important moments happen when you stop trying to be what you think people want and start being who you actually are. Mrs. Richardson leaned back in her chair, and for the first time since entering the room, she smiled. Miss Mitchell, in 30 years of evaluating business proposals, I've rarely heard someone speak with such clarity about both the problem and the solution. Your program isn't just well designed, it's necessary. She looked around the table at her fellow board members. I move to approve the full pilot program funding as proposed, with implementation to begin within 60 days. Seconded, came a voice from across the table. All in favor? James asked. 12 hands went up around the table, 12 unanimous votes for a program that could change thousands of lives. As the board members filed out, discussing implementation details and timeline questions, Emma and I sat in our chairs, still trying to process what had just happened. We did it, Emma whispered. We did it, I repeated, feeling like I might cry from relief and excitement and the overwhelming sense that everything was about to change again. James walked over to us, his smile broader than I'd ever seen it. Ladies, he said, congratulations. You just convinced some of the most skeptical people I know to invest in hope. Now comes the hard part, making it work. But looking at Emma, thinking about the communities we were about to serve, remembering my mother's words about being prepared for this my entire life, I knew we were ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, I stood in the converted warehouse in Flint that had become the headquarters of the Harrison Community Pipeline, watching Emma coordinate a job training workshop while 3 local high school students worked on computer coding exercises at stations we'd set up along the eastern wall. The spring sunlight streaming through the large windows illuminated what had once been an abandoned building and was now a symbol of possibility for an entire community. Sarah, called Miguel Santos, one of our first program participants, waving me over to his computer station. At 17, he had the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of myself at his age, but unlike me, he now had a clear pathway to channel that intelligence into a stable career. Check this out, he said excitedly, pointing to his screen where lines of code had created a functioning inventory management system. Mr. Chen said if I can debug this last section, Harrison Industries might use it for the pilot program at the Detroit facility. I looked at his work, complex, elegant, and nearly flawless. 6 months ago, Miguel had been facing the same limited options I'd grown up with, minimum wage jobs with no advancement potential, or trying to afford college with no financial support. Now he was creating software that a major corporation was considering implementing. This is incredible work, I told him, meaning every word. Have you thought about which university programs you want to apply to for next fall? His face lit up. Actually, I've been talking to Dr. Martinez at Wayne State about their computer science program. With the scholarship fund you guys set up and the guaranteed internship track, I could actually afford it. As Miguel returned to his coding, I felt that familiar surge of satisfaction that had become the best part of my days. This was what we'd envisioned in that conference room 8 months ago. Real opportunities creating real change in real people's lives. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Board meeting in an hour. They want to hear the 6-month progress report. How are you feeling about the numbers? I smiled as I typed back, ready to blow their minds. The numbers were extraordinary. In 6 months, the Harrison Community Pipeline had exceeded every projection we'd made. Youth program participation was at 150% of our target enrollment. The Small Business Grant Program had funded 12 local entrepreneurs, creating over 60 new jobs. Employee retention at the Flint facility was up 30%, and we'd received over 500 applications for positions that historically had been difficult to fill. But more than the statistics, it was the stories that made me know we'd built something meaningful. Emma walked over, clipboard in hand, and that focused expression she got when managing multiple complex projects simultaneously. "The numbers are finalized for the board presentation," she said, handing me a summary sheet. "Sarah, look at this. We've placed 37 program participants in full-time positions, either with Harrison Industries or with our partner companies. The average salary increase for people who completed our technical training programs was 68%. I studied the document, still amazed by what we'd accomplished. What about the expansion proposal? That's the best part. Based on our success here, the board is considering rolling the program out to all 5 Harrison Industries locations. We're talking about potentially impacting 15 communities across 3 states. The drive back to Detroit gave me time to reflect on how much had changed, not just in the communities we were serving, but in my own life. The financial stress that had dominated my existence for so long was gone. My mother was healthy, thriving on the new treatment that our insurance covered completely. I'd moved us into a modest but comfortable apartment in a safe neighborhood, and for the first time in my life, I was saving money instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. But the biggest change was internal. The young woman who had been too embarrassed to ask for a pen 8 months ago had been replaced by someone who could stand in front of corporate boards, manage million-dollar budgets, and make decisions that affected thousands of people's lives. The 42nd floor boardroom felt different this time. Instead of being the nervous outsider hoping for acceptance, I was walking in as the director of the most successful program in Harrison Industries' recent history. Mrs. Richardson, who had become an unexpected ally and mentor, smiled warmly as Emma and I took our seats. "Before we begin with the formal presentation," James said, "I want to share something with all of you. This morning I received a call from Governor Martinez's office. The Harrison Community Pipeline has been selected as the model program for a statewide economic development initiative. Sarah and Emma have been invited to present their approach to the state legislature next month." The room erupted in congratulations and questions. I felt Emma grab my hand under the table, both of us trying to process the magnitude of what James had just announced. "The state wants to use our program as a template?" I asked, still not quite believing it. "More than that," James replied. "They want Harrison Industries to partner with them in implementing similar programs across Michigan with potential federal funding support." Mrs. Richardson leaned forward. "What would this mean in practical terms?" "It would mean scaling our current program by a factor of 10, Emma said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what we were discussing. "Instead of serving 5 communities, we could potentially serve 50. I stood up to begin our formal presentation, but instead of jumping into the statistics and projections, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 8 months ago, I walked into this building carrying a dollar store portfolio and wearing a second-hand blazer, terrified that I didn't belong here. I forgot to bring a pen to my interview, and I was sure that mistake had cost me the only opportunity I might ever have to change my life. I looked around the table at faces that had become familiar, people who had transformed from intimidating strangers into colleagues and supporters. What I didn't understand then was that sometimes our most vulnerable moments reveal our greatest strengths. When I had to ask for help, I learned about the power of humility. When Emma offered that pen without hesitation, she showed me the importance of kindness, even in competitive situations. And when Mr. Harrison saw potential in 2 young women who probably looked like long shots, he demonstrated the kind of leadership that creates opportunities instead of just managing them. I clicked to our first slide, showing before and after photos of the Flint facility and the surrounding community. The Harrison Community Pipeline isn't just a corporate social responsibility program. It's proof that when you invest in people's potential, instead of just managing their limitations, extraordinary things become possible. The presentation that followed was unlike any I'd given before. Instead of nervously rushing through slides, I found myself speaking with the confidence of someone who had lived every aspect of what we'd built. Emma seamlessly handled the operational details, her expertise evident in every answer she gave to board members' questions. When we finished, the room was quiet for a moment before Mrs. Richardson began to applaud. The rest of the board joined in, and I felt Emma squeeze my hand again. "The board's recommendation," Mrs. Richardson said, "is to proceed immediately with statewide expansion planning. Sarah, Emma, We'd like you to lead the scaling initiative with full executive support and whatever resources you need. As the meeting concluded and board members approached us with congratulations and specific questions about implementation, James caught my eye and nodded toward his office. "A moment," he said quietly. Emma and I followed him down the hall to the office where this journey had really begun 8 months ago. The space looked the same, but everything felt different now. "I have something to tell you both," James said, settling into his chair with an expression that was serious but warm. "The board has approved a proposal I made last week. We're creating a new division of Harrison Industries, Community Development and Strategic Partnerships, and I'd like you two to lead it." Emma and I looked at each other, then back at James. "Lead it how?" I asked. "Sarah, I'm offering you the position of Vice President of Community Development. Emma, I'd like you to be our Director of Strategic Partnerships, full executive positions, with the authority and resources to implement programs across the entire Harrison Industries network." The words hung in the air like something from a dream I'd never dared to have. "You're offering me a vice presidency?" I said, trying to process what I'd heard. "But I'm 23 years old, I've been here 8 months, and in those 8 months you've created more positive change than most executives accomplish in their entire careers," James interrupted. "This isn't about traditional qualifications anymore, Sarah. This is about recognizing the people who can actually solve problems and giving them the power to do it." Emma found her voice first. "Yes," she said firmly. "Absolutely yes. I thought about the young woman who had borrowed a pen 8 months ago, so afraid of not belonging that she'd almost let pride cost her everything. I thought about my mother, healthy and proud, finally able to rest instead of constantly worrying about our survival. I thought about Miguel and the dozens of other young people who now had pathways to futures they'd never imagined possible. What comes next is going to be even more challenging than what we've accomplished so far," I said, looking at both of them. "But if we can help create opportunities for people across an entire state, then we say yes," Emma finished. "Yes," I agreed, feeling the word resonate with possibility. As we shook hands on what would become the next chapter of our story, I realized that the frightened young woman who had walked into this building 8 months ago had been transformed into someone I'd never imagined I could become. Not because I'd learned to hide my background or pretend to be someone else, but because I'd learned to see my experiences as strengths instead of limitations. For everyone listening to this story from wherever you are in the world, I thought, remember that sometimes the moments when we feel most out of place are actually moments when we're exactly where we need to be. 6 months later, as I stood in front of the Michigan State Legislature presenting the Harrison Model for Community Economic Development, I carried that borrowed pen in my jacket pocket, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes, and that who we become is often determined not by what we're given, but by how we choose to use what we receive. The young woman who had been too embarrassed to ask for help had become someone whose job was to make sure no one else had to face those moments of desperation alone. And it all started with a forgotten pen and the courage to ask for help when I needed it most.